thank you all very much for coming. I think Barbara is going to be bringing on more people as they join. In the meantime, I'll just introduce Jeremy and Tony, who I'm sure are known to many of you. Jeremy is a writer, both fiction and non-fiction, children's books and books for grown-ups, focusing on the climate crisis and climate injustice. He's the author of the award-winning blog, the Earthbound Report, and he's been content editor and therefore responsible for the website for Join Enough for the past 7 or so years. Tony Emerson was one of the prime movers for the Join Enough program and has recently written a very enjoyable novel called Unlikely Alliances, which brings together some of those Join Enough insights and thinking about the relationship between faith and economics to show how alternative economic theories and thinking could actually work out in practice. So we're delighted to welcome both Tony and Jeremy to talk about the relationship between fiction and the contribution fiction can make to both giving people insights into where we are at present and also giving motivation for future action. So over to you, Jeremy and Tony. And I think, Tony, you're going to start off.
Thanks, John, and thanks for those very kind words. Good evening, all. Christianity, our faith, is based on parables, on stories. The wedding feast of Cana, the miracle of the loaves and fishes. Stories serve to inspire us to live better lives. We need to be inspired to live better lives in relation to climate and biodiversity loss. For many of us, that means a lot of change. Change requires us citizens to imagine a better future so we can embrace the disruption involved in getting there. This point was made by Torsten Bell of the Resolution Foundation in the Observer last month. Stories help us to imagine a better future. Indeed, thinking about the future, any forecasting the future, is in essence a story. My book, Unlikely Alliances, was set a decade or so in the future. The Southampton University Green Stories program suggests that climate and environmental stories need to have optimistic themes if they would encourage readers to take action. Their research shows us that solution-based stories, or stories that smuggle in green ideas or characters into otherwise mainstream stories, are more likely to inspire greener behaviours than catastrophic tales of climate change. Creating a cultural body of work that presents positive visions of sustainable societies is necessary in order to enable that shift towards a more sustainable society. However, most stories set in the climate challenge future are dystopian, meaning that they have very bleak outcomes. We don't need Private Fraser of Dad's Army, you're all doomed, on board on the journey on global sustainability. Yes, climate-inspired fiction stories need to be informed by science, but we need to leave the reader with hope and inspired to ask, at least, what can I do? As advocated by Rupert Reed and colleagues in the Climate Majority Project, a book published in the last year. The back cover of my book, Unlikely Alliances, was written by a colleague in our writing group. Could this be the future? It is 2029. The economy is in crisis. The climate challenge is still unmet. But some locals in a South Coast town believe that effective effective action is both possible and necessary. There is an uplifting story about a community which rises to the challenge. This is an uplifting story about a community which rises to the challenges and creates a buzz not only around their town but the whole country, an inspiring tale of what can be done when people come together for the improvement of their community. It's also a human story of love, friendship and romance, joy and tragedy. It tells us how a shared common purpose can breach any divide, about relationships developing between people, and in one case a very strong relationship. So get inspired. Now my wife Una will read two passages from Unlikely Alliances, firstly from chapter 21.
Hi everybody. Going with the flow, the presbytery Bourne Valley. Hannah, love, wake up. Andy gently taps Hannah on her cheek. What? Andy, already in shirt and trousers, goes back to looking out of the window. The street seems to be flooded, and water is still pouring in. It must be at our front door down below, if it hasn't already got in. Hannah, still bleary-eyed, pulls on her dress, goes over to join him by the window. It's only their second night together since they rekindled their love affair, and the first time in Andy's bed in the presbytery. Andy puts an arm around Hannah's shoulder, and Hannah puts her left hand on Andy's bottom as they both look out, still in a daze about what seems to be happening. Gosh, we knew it was a downpour when we went to sleep. Hannah feels words will help her wake up to this awful reality. We have no idea it would be this bad. They'd been distracted by other things before they went to sleep. They hadn't listened to the evening weather forecast with its dire warning. They both turn round sharply. Someone's coming up the stairs, and apparently turns on the light in the kitchen diner down the corridor. Andy goes out to see who it is. Frank, you've been outside already? Frank Shanahan is dressed in a waterproof and wellies, a civil engineer at the Downshire County Council. He's one of the presbytery lodgers. I got a call from my boss about half an hour ago. The Bourne has just burst its banks, over 300 metres from here. I've been asked to survey the scene as I'm on the spot. Andy, I've got to go out again and do more of a recce. Could you follow me down and close the door as rapidly as possible after me, putting those rags and bags I found against it as firmly as you can? I'll phone you when I need to come back in. Andy does as requested. On hearing Andy closing the door behind Frank, Hannah thinks it's safe to go into the kitchen, where she switches on the kettle and looks round for tea bags and mugs. It's her first time in Andy's kitchen. Andy has hardly returned to join Hannah in the kitchen when his phone rings. It's Frank, he says. Andy says it's as I feared. There's now the proverbial torrent going down through the side gate to the church hall and the gardens. Oh God, that's where the African refugees are. I'll go down straight away and ask someone here to seal our front door after me. Just then a fair-haired woman with freckles appears at the kitchen door in her pyjamas. I've heard a commotion. Father Andrew, what can I do to help? Andy reflects himself. I wish you'd slept through all this, Carol, especially when he sees the surprise and rather critical exclamation on Carol's face as she notices Hannah in the kitchen. As calmly as possible he introduces them. Carol, this is Hannah. Hannah, this is Carol Mitchell, another of our lodgers here. She teaches at St. Simon's. Who can I say Hannah is? Carol looks at Hannah. I think I've seen you at Mass here a few times. Hannah nods. I suppose you're Frank's latest, lady friend, continues Carol in a somewhat clipped Aussie accent. She doesn't need explicit words to convey her disapproval. Hannah feels herself blush. Phew, I won't disabuse you, lady, not yet anyway, but I sense somehow you're no permissive liberal. Hannah looks away, so she can actually avoid saying yes. Andy is glad he has a very good excuse to get away from this awkward exchange. Ladies, time is of the essence in this situation. Can one of you join me with Frank in helping the refugees down the hall and the camp in the garden, and the other hold the fort up here? I'll pull on some more appropriate clothes and join you, Andrew, is Carol's quick response, looking disapprovingly at Hannah's rather short dress. I can seal the front door after you go out, and see what I can do to get something warm to eat and drink here, for you workers and for the refugees. Hannah is glad to have a role for herself, and one that doesn't involve that Aussie woman. Hannah's search for food has not revealed very much. Andy seems to have only a packet each of muesli and cornflakes, a few tins of baked beans, some eggs, and a rather stale brown loaf. She hears the landline ringing downstairs. 3:25 a.m. Better answer it. She follows the ringing tone down to the presbytery front room. May I speak to Father Andrew? Requests a man in what Hannah would describe as a posh voice. I'm afraid he's outside trying to help the refugees in our grounds. Cope with this dreadful flood we're having. May I ask who's calling? Oh, this is Marcus Cavendish, the husband of Reverend Mandy at Christ Church. We realise that you may need some help down there. Oh, she's off her phone now. I'll get Mandy for you. She waits on the phone. She can just about hear Marcus whispering something to his wife. The woman was answering her phone. I wonder if it's Andy's friend Hannah, who you mentioned a few times. Oh dear, reflects Hannah. Our secret affair seems to be about as secure as the banks of the River Bourne. Now we move on to chapter 28, a few weeks later, when the relationship between Hannah and Carol has improved a little bit. The tea room in Revive and Thrive, Saturday afternoon, November the 17th. The Revive and Thrive premises can still be described as a work in progress. It's located in Oxfam's second-hand shop on the High Street, combined with a former cafe next door. Oxfam are being one of the stakeholders in this new venture. In the old shop, clothes and other second-hand goods were still being displayed, but there is a workshop to the back of the store so that customers can see goods being renovated, while the connecting door between the two buildings is still being constructed. Cafe is serving snacks to customers, and there are also attractive displays of renovated garments on the racks in the cafe. You're an amazing lady, Hannah Hamilton. Straight away you spotted that green dress that's right for me, says Carol. It's easy. You're slim, medium height. Only question was finding a colour to match for your very fair and freckled complexion, and having less choice in our now constrained world actually makes deciding easier. Carol passed half the slice of carrot cake she bought to share with Hannah, our calorie-laden treat. I see we also stock a good supply of those new long-lasting tights. Quite expensive, but worth it. And while I'm here, I think I'll buy a second dress to wear at Mass some weeks. I could wear it this evening. I saw a navy one that I quite liked. I'm really so grateful to you. No need, as I said, no need to thank me. I'm enjoying myself. But may I bend your ear for a few minutes, Carol? Of course, as long as it's not about you and Father Andrew. Carol is now looking slightly reproving. Nothing like that. Jamie Creasy, the councillor, texted me this morning to say that Bourne Valley has been shortlisted for the Emerald New Deal Award. Sounds great, but what's this award? It's for a town or district that has supplied the new Green Deal ideas particularly well. It's called Emerald because emerald is a very bright shade of green. I can see why Bourne Valley has been chosen. As well as this wonderful Revive and Thrive, there are the other repair and maintenance workshops, especially the one that's just opened in the Anglican Church Hall. Quite a few of our Year 11s are applying for apprenticeships there now. Carol sounds relaxed and approving again. Hannah takes out a pen and pad. Jamie asked me to make a list of all Of them all, even in a town of this size, he said, the left hand doesn't always know what the right hand is doing. May I use you as a sounding board? Of course. I'll record this list on my phone as well, if I may. Hannah nods, thinking Carol is just going to keep this record to be helpful. So let's start. We've already mentioned the activity set up by Long Life Bourne Valley. Then there's the building renovation and installation programme. I'll ask Andy the precise name for it. He's been a trustee. They're employing some of the refugees. I see them working on the older houses along Station Road on my way to school in the morning, Carol adds. But the mandatory installation programme has been slow getting going. Lots of political opposition. So many house-proud obsessors objecting to it. I can see you're a bit like me, Hannah, a woman of passionate convictions, even if we're not always passionate about the same things. Certainly over something like this, when people could be employed and carbon emissions could be reduced, but for the selfish small-mindedness of some people. Hannah realises she's gobbled down her piece of cake in anger, so she continues her list. Then there's the Western Downs Renewable Energy Programme, which will soon be supplying most of Downshire and wider afield. Isn't there also a lot of work going on now growing more food locally? Didn't you say that the Brightside hotels will be sourcing a lot of local fruit and veg next year? Carol adds another possible item to the list. Yes, not much has come on stream as yet, but one of the golf clubs and a few of the riding schools have been converted to horticulture. One of the difficulties is water supply. Frank is working on that in the county council. And lots of businesses and householders are now converting unused ground and parking space to food growing. Hannah, don't forget to blow your own trumpet. Father Andrew is saying how you and your hotel have led the local hotel federation in commissioning the purchase of local food and other produce. Anna sits back and smiles. Please call him Andy. Everyone else does. It's what he likes. But Carol doesn't respond, reminding Hannah of the tension that still lingers between them. Hannah continues. There's also a new tool sharing project, which I'll ask Malcolm, our facilities manager, about. But there are other aspects to this that any honest report must include. Go on, say more, invites Carol. Firstly, common sense. If a project looks promising but has only just started, it's dangerous to crow too much about it. Snags or hiccups will inevitably arise, particularly if there are people who will only be too happy to point at them to put egg on our faces. Which leads me to my second point. Any change, any new development in the commercial world affects some business interests. That renovated dress you've just bought, Carol, which should do you for a year or two, means that someone's not making and selling you the throwaway garments you might have been buying. Those vested interests have to be careful and devious. They can't really shout about their rights to make throwaway rubbish, but as Jamie and our friend Noel remind me, they'll put up a fight.
Thanks, Una. And now we go back to just the last few words in this. Now I address a different question. What kind of behaviours do we want our stories to lead to? There's a lot of greenwash out there, a lot of alleged solutions to the climate crisis. I'm indebted to Canon Barry Goodwin, formerly in a social responsibility promoting role in Anglican Diocese of Southwark, for this model of the change process. We can pursue change at three levels: the political level, through national and transnational government and intergovernmental agencies, corporations and large-scale business bodies, large-scale NGOs. Parochial, local level agencies such as councils, health trusts, colleges and universities, more local businesses, and of course church parishes. These should have a particular role in innovation and change creation. For example, local renewable energy, repair and maintenance, housing insulation and renovation, food growing, etc. And the lowest level, personal and household level change. Now, the changes at these three levels should be mutually reinforcing. For example, if you personally have switched to renewable energy and are involved in a local renewable energy project in some way, you are more likely to be a campaigner for governmental support for renewable energy. In the sample reading from unlikely alliances, you heard my belief in the importance of little p, the parochial or community action level, in creating sustained mutually reinforcing engagement. The renewable energy action research on the Downs, the Revive and Thrive shops, building renovation and building installation schemes, etc. Also, there's obviously the cooperation between the hotel and the University Business School in promoting UK holidays and business meetings instead of people flying abroad for holidays and conferences. All of this, of course, needs government support and facilitation. We see in chapters 23 and 24 of the story how they're working in Bold Valley and Downshire to help keep the Progressive Coalition government in power. Well, thank you, everybody. If you want to buy copies, I think it's in the chat thing about how you can buy them to read out directly from me, or you can get an ebook version from Kobo or Kindle. And I've also nearly finished a sequel to this novel called Building the Alliances, which will be out next year. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Now, Tony has been speaking as a practitioner, as a writer, and talking about his story and how it incorporates different levels of political action and personal action into a story. I'm not going to talk about my own fiction because it's very different, and this is the only work of fiction that I've had published. It's not really for your audiences. It's for sort of 7 to 10-year-olds, and it's funny, and there's nothing useful in it about the global economy. So what I wanted to do instead was talk to you as more of a reader about some of the stories and novels that I've read and that I've come across that I think tell us something about the world and how we imagine a new world, and some of the theory behind that as well. This is Tony's book that he was just talking about, Unlikely Alliances, and I should have shown this earlier, shouldn't I? This was the personal, parochial, and political structure that Tony was just talking about there with the levels of action. Now, this is something I wanted to start off with here. There's this famous quote from the Nigerian poet Ben Okri that people are as healthy and confident as the stories they tell themselves. Sick storytellers can make nations sick. And it's a good reminder, I think, that we humans depend on stories to orient ourselves in the world. The world can be very confusing sometimes, and we naturally fall back on stories to help us remember who we are and what's important. It's how we make sense of ourselves, where we've come from and where we're going. And that's true for us as individuals. We all have a story of where we've come from, and it's true of societies as well. And our culture is full of powerful stories that explain who we are. We get myths like the Golden Age, for example, a very common myth, much deployed during the Brexit campaign, telling us that things were better in the past if we could only go back. Or we get myths like the island nation story, a sort of very pithy kind of summary of where we've come from. And you can use those stories to kind of identify ourselves, but we can also use those sorts of stories to close doors to other people. So I wanted to spend a few minutes thinking about some of the underlying mythology of where we are from an economics perspective, because of Joanne enough, and then talk about some examples of how things could be different from the bookshelves. I want to start off with this book here, if you've come across it, George Monbiot's book, Out of the Wreckage, because he talks very specifically about stories. And he argues that there's one particular story that kind of defines our age and how we understand ourselves from an economics point of view, and that the story of our time is neoliberalism. And he has a new book coming out on this as well, imminently. And he summarizes the story that neoliberalism tells us with 3 points. The first is that state overreach in the 20th century led to disasters like the Nazis in Germany or Stalin in Russia, and that humanity barely survived these collectivist philosophies, and they crushed freedom and opportunity. The answer to this, point number 2, is full freedom for entrepreneurs and investors to follow their best ideas, leave behind state organization, and the invisible hand of the markets will take charge of everything. And point number 3, we can all take part in this economy as competing individuals. The best way for the market to distribute its benefits is not state control, but for us all to pursue our own selfish interests. And the invisible hand will make sure that everybody gets what it needs. And the story is very self-reinforcing because it has this promise of wealth and freedom for all, provided they work hard, of course. And all the counter-arguments are already built in. So anyone suggesting a greater role for the state or for regulation can be easily rebuffed. Well, the communists did that, and look how that turned out. And we still see the echoes of that sort of storytelling going on today. And of course, the problem is that this story isn't true. It's one of those sick stories that Ben Okri warns us about, and it makes nations sick. Following our own selfishness, and we know this as Christians, it undermines community and it undermines reciprocity, and it breeds loneliness and alienation. Collective action then becomes impossible, and democracy is hollowed out. It's a false narrative based on a flawed understanding of human nature. Neoliberalism paints us as people in competition with each other, this sort of war of all against all that Thomas Hobbes once described. And humans are not like that. And this is something that George Monbiot says. We're a uniquely cooperative species. We are better than we are told we are, says Monbiot, better than we are induced to be. Ultimately, the dominant story of neoliberalism can only fail us because it's false. It's a distortion of humanity, and in the long run, it's never going to fit with who we are. Now, in the past, Christians might have had a particular word for that kind of a story, and that word is heresy. Now, that's a very charged word, of course, and in the history of the church, it's rarely been deployed with grace. But more often than not, it's been used to sort of crush dissent and reinforce the power of the church. But the danger of heresy, from the way I'm using it here, is not to sort of strike down a false doctrine or to tell people that they've got some theological idea wrong. It's more that you're choosing a sick story, one that will unravel on you further down the line. To use an example from history, we can look at the story of the Barmen Declaration, which was issued by German evangelicals in 1934 in response to the formation of an official pro-Nazi state church. And it was authored by theologians of the time, and it was a declaration that insisted on the independence of the church and that refused to acknowledge any other authority above Christ and the scriptures. And it said, we reject the false doctrine that the church should appropriate the characteristics, the tasks, and the dignity of the state, thus becoming an organ of the state. So to these theologians who were drafting this statement, fascism was a heresy. It was a false doctrine that would ultimately only fail the church and fail the nation. It was not a story to live by. And so some churches were choosing to ally themselves with the Nazi regime, and they were publicly refuting that. And as it happens, of course, history proved them to be entirely right. It was a sick story, and it made the nation sick. And the vision that the Nazis had of human life still haunts us today. Denouncing a false doctrine is not enough, however. Stories don't really work to logic, necessarily. Stories resonate with us. They provide us with easy ways to understand the world, and so we don't cast them off lightly. And as Monbiot says, the only thing that can displace a story is a story. That's where the storytellers come in. And we'll come on to fiction in a moment, but let's just stay with the idea of storytelling for a moment. In Out of the Wreckage, George Monbiot offers a counter-narrative to neoliberalism, which he calls coming home to ourselves and creating a politics of belonging. And he suggests that we start with local action to restore community and to renew civic life, and that would purposefully erode that competitive individualism and begin to nurture a more cooperative side of humanity. And of course, in that, there's lots of overlap with what what we've seen in those excerpts from Tony's book that Una just read to us. The Christian political thinker Alex Evans investigates guiding stories in his book, The Myth Gap, which is an interesting one. And he sees stories of redemption and restoration as particularly critical in our current time. So there's this quote here. I think that tales of restoration are just about the most powerful and resonant kind there are. They speak directly to a profound yearning in all of us, an instinct that while the world may be broken, it can also be made right again, and that this may, at some level, be what we are here to do. And putting this idea into action, Alex Evans was one of the writers behind Tearfun's work on a restorative economy. And there was a research report a few years ago, and now the church-facing resource, Restorative Revolution, which is one of the recommended resources on the Joy in Enough website. And the restorative economy, and it's also in the Myth Gap, suggests 3 principles to look for in the story of restoration for our time. And you can summarize them in these 3 very short bullet points: a larger us, a longer future, and a better good life. To say a little bit more about those, a larger us is to do with interdependence and justice. It's expanding the sense of who we are. So rather than closing ourselves down and protecting ourselves, we're looking to find solidarity and to include. And so in the excerpt from Tony's book, we heard about refugees being accommodated within Tony's vision of the future there. A longer future is almost like an intergenerational covenant and a focus on conserving creation for the future. And a better good life is one that challenges consumerism and its false promises of what a good life is, and calls us to something much more fundamental and a sense of purpose and belonging in the world. They're 3 very simple principles, I think, and they're really useful ones for us at Joy in Enough. We want a more inclusive economy, one where everyone has a stake and has enough, and where nobody is left behind. And we want to break down divides between us and them and the haves and the have-nots. And a larger us is a really good summary of that. And a longer future speaks to our goal of sustainability and long-term flourishing. And a better good life, of course, is what Joy in Enough is all about. We're not about self-denial and about saying no to good things. We want good lives for everyone. And consumerism signposts people in the wrong direction for that. A good life, a life worth living, lies elsewhere. Another alternative story is from my own book with Catherine Trebeck, The Economics of Arrival. And in that book, we contrast 2 different stories as well. The myth of everlasting economic growth, which is like a plane which takes off and then never lands. And we suggest the idea of arrival as a counter story to that. In richer countries, we can say that we have arrived in the place that previous generations hoped for. And we have enough if we distributed it better. But I think of my own grandmother who lived in very real poverty in Liverpool and walked to school barefoot. The world that she imagined for me as her a grandchild, we've built it. My children don't walk barefoot to school anymore. We've achieved that. And why would we put that at risk in the pursuit of an endless more, which has, no end to it? These sorts of stories matter because they help us to imagine how things could be different. And there's a very interesting book by Amitav Ghosh, who's an Indian novelist and occasionally a climate writer as well. And he says the climate crisis is also a crisis of culture and thus of the imagination. And his book, The Great Derangement, here notes that literature, certainly at the time when he wrote this one a few years ago now, about 10 years ago, hadn't really grappled with climate change yet. Climate change was creeping into the world of arts and literature, but we hadn't yet equipped ourselves with ways to imagine a way out of our predicament. We get a similar theme from Rob Hopkins, the founder of the Transition Towns movement, who wrote that we faced vast crises that demand imaginative and urgent responses and a reimagining of everything, and we are not up to it. So this idea of a crisis of imagination. For Christians, I think there's something prophetic about this too. The prophets called people beyond their immediate circumstances. Sometimes they foretold the consequences of bad decisions. And when times were hard, they cast forward for a positive vision of restoration, something hopeful for people to strive towards in faith. So storytelling is not just about entertainment. It can open up new possibilities when we can imagine them. More books have been written since Amitav Ghosh complained that fiction hadn't engaged yet with the climate crisis. And there are older books that also drew on this upcoming predicament many years ago. So I wanted to have a look at some of the books that have done both sides of that have foreseen coming problems and that also have written prophetically about how we can overcome them. So first of all, sorry, where are we going? Some stories of warning to start off with. When we're sort of browsing the bookshelves in Waterstones or hopefully a smaller independent bookshop, it's not hard to find novels that are set in the context of the climate crisis. And some of these go back quite a long time. So J.G. Ballard wrote The Drowned World. It was his first novel. It was decades ago. Or The Sea in Summer by George Turner was another one that decades ago was imagining global warming and its consequences. They were both works of speculative fiction written when rising seas felt a very long way off. Nowadays, we can see the reality already. And the book here, Pichaya Sudbanthad's Bangkok Wakes to Rain, is a really interesting book that imagines the future of Bangkok, which is expected to be completely inundated in the coming decades. So what had been a sort of speculative science fiction kind of story when J.G. Ballard was writing about it is now a matter of grieving a loss, now that novelists are writing about it today. Bangkok will be uninhabitable. And that is something to grieve for all the people who've grown up there. Another favorite of mine that deals with changing times is Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior, which contrasts very ordinary lives with extraordinary natural phenomena and captures the sense of the uncanny as landscapes that we think we know change around us. Get something similar in Rumaan Alam's book, Leave the World Behind, which is a little bit more surreal, a little bit more sort of hard to grasp. But it's about characters struggling to maintain a sense of normality in the face of a threat that they don't fully understand and that is so much bigger than they are. The climate crisis unbalances us and it pushes us towards difficult decisions as individuals and as societies. And there are books exploring that. There's the classic Parable of the Sower, which is not about the biblical story. It's a story written a few decades ago now, but that is strangely prescient in the era of Trump, where Octavia Butler has imagined America wrestling with chronic wildfires and extreme politics. And closer to home, John Lanchester's The Wall combines rising seas with rising nationalism. And it's a very bleak vision of Britain turning to fascist protectionism in the face of climate migration. A couple of other examples before we get to something a bit more hopeful. Last year, I read this book, Ridley Walker, by Russell Hoban, which is a very unusual book. It's been recommended to me by both Tim Jackson and Ian Christie, who's a friend of Joy and Enough. And it tells a story of a young man who is exiled from his community, set in Kent, 1,000 years after a nuclear disaster that has caused society to revert to the Iron Age. So it's a very bleak sort of scenario. And what's unusual about the book is that Hoban imagines that language itself has devolved and literacy is rare. And so the writing of the book is sort of this very broken, purposefully broken English And he imagines that people in the future, they vaguely understand that there was a consumer society, there were things like television, there were things like planes, but those have become almost mythical things that people don't understand. Rowan Williams is a fan of this book, and he wrote about it last year, comparing the threats today with the ones that Hoban was writing about in 1980 when the book was published. And he says global politics is trapped in zero-sum games. The massive menace of a climate crisis is as terrifying a prospect as the nuclear horrors described in Ridley Walker. It is a time for us to look unmercifully at our expectations of limitless economic growth, a fantasy that will eventually strip us of all power to manage our environment. And none of those examples are positive stories, and that's okay. Dystopia can be instructive, highlighting the self-destructing tendencies in our current politics. But we also need positive visions, and so let's look at some of those. Can we turn our imaginations towards the solutions, as Tony has suggested? Here are some novels that I think point us towards a more positive way out of the climate crisis. So one is the young adult fiction novel, The Summer We Turned Green by William Sutcliffe. And it was inspired in part by his teenage son's interest in the climate strikes. And he wanted to write something that got young people to engage with the issue of climate change, but that didn't fill them with despair. That was his specific aim. And it's a very funny book. And one of its major themes is overcoming differences in order to work together to save what we love. I particularly like this book because it's about trying to stop airport expansion. And I live a mile from Luton Airport, which they're very committed to expanding. So it's a book. All of this is explored with humor and with humility. It deals with sort of direct action and the politics of direct action, and how people build alliances with each other in order to see off the airport expansion. And it's exactly the kind of larger us that Alex Evans calls for in his work on restoration. A second book there in the middle there is Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, which is a novel that's all about climate solutions and ideas. And it's probably as close as you could get to reading the Join Enough website in novel form. It's full of different voices and different ideas. It makes it interesting and engaging to actually read sort of climate policy. It sometimes reads like a thriller, but it's also all about diplomacy, about trust, about the importance of overcoming self-interest. And it plays out over many decades. And it's a good example of the longer future that I was talking about earlier. And then to complete that trilogy, a novel that I think captures the idea of a better good life might be Becky Chambers' book, A Psalm for the Wild-Built, which is a short and rather beautiful and very funny as well, novel about a tea monk called Dex. And this is like a chaplaincy role where the tea monk travels from village to village and makes tea for people, and people come and speak to them and sort of solve their problems. And then he becomes disillusioned with his calling, and Dex wanders into the wilderness and meets a robot who seeks to understand humans. And this is very unexpected, as robots walked away from human civilization centuries before and haven't been seen since. And like in Ridley Walker's world, the technologies of the past are sort of mythological and barely understood, and people make do with a much simpler life on the other side of crisis. But where Russell Hoban had imagined a sort of dog-eat-dog world of people struggling for resources, Becky Chambers has imagined a humanity at peace with having less, and still capable, or perhaps even more capable, of kindness and compassion. As Christians, we have a hopeful view of the long-term future, but the decisions we make in the interim shape the world that we live in and the one that our children will inherit. And contrasting stories like these, stories of despair and stories of progress that I've talked about here, they echo the words of Moses in Deuteronomy 30, where he says, "See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction." And he urged the people of Israel to consider these paths and to choose life. And that's an invitation that we face today in very different circumstances. We know that the consumer way of life is unsustainable and cannot continue. But how it ends and what life looks like on the other side, that remains to be seen. Decisions that we make now will shape future generations for many years into the future, and maybe considering these questions through fiction can open up some different ways forward. One final thing to finish off with. In his surreal novel Timequake, Kurt Vonnegut spins a yarn about how humanity gets trapped in a decade-long déjà vu, and everyone powerlessly watches themselves for 10 years as they make the same mistakes and the same bad choices, and they're stuck replaying the last 10 years of their life without being able to influence it. And then when the timequake ends, people are so bored and depressed of just watching their life play before them for an entire decade that they've forgotten that they have free will. And only the protagonist of the book emerges from the coma with any sense of agency. And he calls people back to themselves with a mantra. And in many ways, it summarizes the task for those waking up to neoliberal consumer capitalism and the inequality, alienation, and environmental destruction it has caused. And his little mantra is, to echo Ben Oakley at the beginning, you were sick, but now you're well again, and there's work to do. And I'll finish there. And we've got some time to have a little bit of a discussion about any of that, or any fiction that might have inspired you, or things that, that you think are hopeful signs of a new economy that you've come across in stories. John, did you want to say something or ask a question at that point?
Well, just to expand that, of course, films maybe are also a form of fiction, so we might want to consider films within your question about fiction.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Any
carry on.
Any thoughts on things that you've read or seen or heard that have given you that sense of the future that Jeremy's been talking about, and Tony? Maybe one question to ask. I mean, there are a lot of people who are moved by fiction and novels. There's also, one of the besetting issues of our age is the need for facts and data and verification. I mean, just to ask Jeremy and Tony, I mean, how do you see those two, in a sense, contradictory motions playing out over the next few years? That need for stories on the one hand, and the need for verification, for data, for information, for verification.
Yes, Tony, do you want to talk about that?
My immediate response is that they're complementary. That we need to be factually based in what we're advocating. We need to be scientifically based, but basically, science on its own, scientific analysis, scientific exposition on its own, isn't going to be enough. We need to inspire people, and you don't inspire people. You need to engage people's emotions. Yes, some of us may have been very impressed by some scientific discoveries, as I was in my youth, but to actually impel people, to motivate people to action, you need something more emotional, and the story does that job. Whether it's film, as John says, or whether it's any other, even music can do it.
Thank you. Debbie, you've raised a hand, so if you can unmute.
Is that right? Is that okay?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, that's fine.
I had the exciting experience of joining the Gold Saving Creation course that we do in Leeds Diocese, and I'm on it this year. And one of the tasks we had to do at the end of the first term was to watch a TED talk that George Monbiot had given about this whole area that you're talking about, Jeremy, and to write our own restoration story. And it was terrific fun. And I really enjoyed doing it. And so I kind of commend that sort of exercise to anybody who gets really wrapped up in fiction as I do. But I also want to thank you, because you've provided me with such a repertoire of books that I haven't read. I'm just dying to get round to reading some of them. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to hear that that's being done as an exercise, because I think that there is something very powerful that we have as Christians, that idea of restoration, and it's all through the Bible, because there's all those stories of the exile and the restoration that comes after it, of death and resurrection and all those sorts of things. That it's such a rich theme in the Bible. And when you look at the state of the economy and the state of the climate and all those things, often Christians will talk about stewardship, but I often think, how do you steward a depleted ocean? How do you deplete a forest? How do you steward a forest which has been cut down? There's nothing to steward. The story that we need is one of restoration at that point. How do we rebuild? How do we make this better? How do we bring healing? And that, to me, is a very powerful story, which we ought to be talking a lot more about.
And
obviously, you don't want to write. Sorry, carry on.
Sorry, I was going to say, for me, a book that really helped me with that was Braiding Sweetgrass, the Robin Wall Kimmerer book, which actually looks at a lot of the devastation and ways to rebuild, and is, I think, absolutely inspirational.
I would second that. And in terms of books that told me things I'd never stopped to think about, I think there was a higher ratio of extraordinary things to say in the book Braiding Sweetgrass than anything else I've read for a while. So yes, I would second that recommendation.
I
Mark.
think, well, there's Mark. James, you had your hand up. Do you want to say something?
I think Mark sat his up for longer than me. So
okay.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, James. No rush.
Yeah,
okay,
thank you.
James.
I was wondering, like, I'm interested in these books. I've read The Wall, for example. But did I choose to read that because I'm interested in this topic? I'm very committed to this and very frightened by all that's going on. How do we reach those people who maybe think, oh, well, it's not that important, or even people who might deny all this? I have a thought. There was a film out a while back which I actually saw, which was called Don't Look Up. And I wondered if that was maybe a popular film. I'm not sure quite how popular it was, that had a more subtle approach. But
yes,
so would attract more people if they only engaged and thought a little bit about it.
Yes, that's a really good example. So I've only talked about books today just because I wanted to kind of not expand it too widely. But you're absolutely right. How do you get people to engage with this stuff? Well, that's the joy of a well-written book that's entertaining and that's funny and that is rewarding to read and enjoyable. And yet, and its point is made subtly along the way. If you put on the back of the book, this book is about the circular economy, no one will read it. But if you can weave those themes into a story which people want to read and engage with, then they'll learn something along the way, even without noticing it. And that's one of the secrets of good storytelling, I think. Don't Look Up is a really interesting example, actually, because I can't remember the director's name now, but he specifically said, I wanted to make I'm worried about climate change. I'm distressed about where we're going. I didn't want to make a documentary because there's enough of those sort of look at the state of things, climate documentaries. He wanted to make something that was funny and that would entertain people and that would make them think. And it was a Netflix release, so it wasn't in the cinemas. It went straight to Netflix, and it was the most watched film of that month. Widely discussed, very much hated in America by people who don't agree with climate change, but watched nonetheless. Provoked a huge debate, and that idea of "don't look up" has been used repeatedly, and it keeps coming up in American politics. People have been using it almost as shorthand for the way that people will deny an obvious truth if they don't like it. So thank you for raising that. That's a really interesting example of storytelling.
Great. Mark, then Jim.
Okay, I'm probably going to contradict myself here, but yes, I read Tony's book probably 4 years ago, and it inspired me to get involved in a localism project of the Jubilee Christian Cooperative Farm down in Larne. So obviously the book inspired me to do that. But since then, I've been more inclined to read non-fiction, looking for the facts that Tony was talking about. So maybe different people go different ways. I suppose I've tended to read the non-fiction stuff because I've been looking for sort of big solutions, that could be that are scalable. And that I've read The Ministry of the Future. I just can't remember what big solutions came out of that. I mean, I think it was a positive book because it evolved to a better future. But it depends on your mindset. I think some people sort of like fiction, like stories. I like that the non-fiction side because it gets some. I can look for, does the book present the problems and then give me some answers, and I sort of of that mindset. I think some people are. So I think it's horses for courses probably. I don't know what Tony and Jeremy would divide up their reading by how much non-fiction they read versus how much fiction, on how they strike the balance there.
Oh, it's a good point. People like different things, and that's fine. I read both, and I find different things in all of them. I read a lot of non-fiction, but I always have a novel on the go as well. When I was younger, I didn't read fiction. I sort of stopped after school. And then I was only a few years later that I came back to fiction. And then I just thought, well, why did I do that? I've missed so many great things. And a well-written, thoughtful novel will have just as much truth in it than as a non-fiction book. Because it tells us deep things about ourselves, and we understand each other. We see the world from each other's eyes, through each other's eyes, and you can do things in fiction that you can't do any other way. And you can also smuggle in your messages, or you can have themes that people aren't expecting. There's a book that I didn't actually mention this one in the talk, but this book, Mortal Engines, is another young adult fiction book, and it's about a world where cities are now on wheels and they're enormous and they sort of rumble through the landscape and devour each other. And it's an extraordinary idea. But Philip Reeve, I heard an interview where he was talking about it, and he said it's specifically about the idea of endless economic growth. That this is the logical conclusion of that, is this world where people devour each other. That's was a very popular book, probably about 18 years ago with young people. It's a talk about economic growth, but you wouldn't know it at all. It's just sort of smuggled in there. You wouldn't get young people to sit down and read a book about economic growth, but they will read that one, and they might then see the connection themselves later.
Yeah. Great. So Jim and then Colin.
I've got 4 points if I remember them. One is I picked up a copy of The Wall outside our local library on the help yourself for a donation. So that was nice. I didn't know what it was, and I read it.
Mm.
The second one is responding to how do we reach people around us with this. My personal feeling is I need to reach me first, and to have in my head and my conversation and my being hope and positivity, which I need to reach. I need imagination, and I need to know how to bridge that when I'm talking to people. I'm just being with people. How you go past the oh yeah, it's terrible, isn't it? The third thing is that over this last weekend, I live in Halesworth in Suffolk, where we've just had the Ink Festival, which was a festival of basically short plays, and there was one sketch which was very funny, which was about basically a climate campaign and knocks on someone's door. Can I interest you in our climate campaign? And the guy has answered the door covered in blood with a gun, and he's just shot somebody. And they have this his wife's lover, I think, is shot, and he's very polite, but they have this conversation in the end about, okay, if you're going to do this, can we do it more sustainably, please? And how he could go about killing people but not ruin the planet. And actually connecting to me, we're trying to find solar panels which don't involve slavery. And we all walk around potentially with blood on our shirts. And it's something that really, really struck a chord with me. And the fourth thing is, I've just seen there is an invitation for a open mic night at our local shop, which includes you can get a tarot card reading there as well if you want, about whether I volunteer my services to do something, in which case what would I do? So that's my thoughts.
Okay.
Thank you. Colin.
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you very much for a very interesting and rather different, less technical than usual presentation, perhaps, which is perhaps part of the point, isn't it? I'm afraid I'm a bit like with Mark Dick. I'm a bit of a geek. I'm a data science nerd and so on. So I don't really read much fiction, but I do watch the TV and watch movies, although I never pay for them. Incidentally, the Engines book that you just mentioned has been made into a film, so it's appeared on TV. So I know the story because it's on TV. The thing that gets me is that the communications through a book and through moving media, audio, and particularly visual film, is a very different. You emote more with a film, don't you? In one sense, because you don't have to create the imagery and the ideas in your own mind through the text, through then imagining. You just get given it with the visuals created by the cinematographers. I do wonder a little bit. Here's my question. With film, I'm sorry, I'm getting slightly off topic, talking more about film, but with things like films, is there a danger that they're often majoring on either the personal romantic element or the victorious loner or the misfit who solves the problem or whatever, or they often tend to be rather apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic. I mean, some very extremely so, but things like the Day After Tomorrow, which of course was explicitly a climate change film, but probably completely wrong on the way it's actually going to happen in terms of the science. And it gives people the idea that, well, it's going to just sort of suddenly happen and it'll just be a disaster and we'll just try and get through it and some of us will survive, rather than this is a progressive slippery slope and actually we could start clawing our way back up it if only we would, enough of us get together and do enough each to deal with that. What do you think about that problem, that sometimes these things can be sort of almost doomsterish in the result,
There's two really interesting things that come into that that you've identified in films. One is that it's almost always a story of a heroic individual. usually a man, usually an American, who solves the crisis on behalf of everybody. Whether they're a superhero or whether they sort of have to sacrifice themselves or whatever it is, it's almost always an individual effort or sort of an underground thing. Very rarely is it a matter of organizing everybody to do it. And so I think that's just a reflection of an individualistic society, that the heroes we imagine are also heroic individuals. It's much harder to tell a story of people pulling together. And there again is, where a story can be not controversial, what's the word I'm looking for, more subversive, by talking about the collective and about how we pull together. And this is something that that Tony's done in Unlikely Alliances. Of course, I'll let Tony talk about that in a minute. And the other one, of course, the other aspect of that is so many stories end with the oppressive empire falling, and then that's it. What you don't get, the evil corporation or this overreaching CEO or whatever it is that we're all threatened by, they're toppled, and the credits roll. What we don't see is how people pull together to rebuild on the other side of that. So you get some dystopian scenario that the evil president is dethroned and the revolution has come. That's only the beginning of the work, and movies are terrible at doing that extra bit and showing the restoration on the other side of it. And those are really important things. Tony, did you want to talk about that collective heroism rather than individual heroism, since that's the theme of your book?
It's a barrier I had to overcome in writing. A lot of people in the writing world say you have to have only just one or two main characters. You can't have a story about the collective. And that's why I'm really glad that I pursued with this book and the sequel to it, because it's about people acting as a community, not individual heroism, as you eloquently described, Jeremy.
Yeah.
And basically, you can only achieve things with lots of people doing it. Lots of people doing it in harmony. You can't achieve very much as an individual.
And as you said earlier, that those working on those three levels as well, Tony, the personal, parochial, the national and political.
Yes.
Are there?
One thing about Christianity is it's a collective faith. It's not about individuals. We go to a church to worship. We don't just do individual meditation.
Yeah. One last question from Catherine, and then I think we'll.
So I wanted to ask a question about films. Staying on films, there have been some excellent documentaries, haven't there, about fossil fuel companies knowing the truth and hiding it. And I'm thinking of fictional films that really unearth the truth about justice in other areas. So I'm thinking of The Constant Gardener, which is based on a novel by John le Carré, and Erin Brockovich. Do we know of any films about just unearthing the truth and telling the truth that are fictional films, and are about the truth about who knew what we're doing to the planet?
Yeah, I can't think of one specifically about climate change. Like you say, there've been some about the tobacco industry and pharmaceuticals and various other things. There must be some about oil and gas and things as well. I can't think of them off the top of my head. I have to get back to you on that one. They must be out there.
What about the Pelican Brief, the first John Grisham? Was that would that count?
Trying to remember who the villain is in that. I saw it a long time ago.
No, I can't remember the name of the villain, but that was about an ecosystem, wasn't it, when it came to it?
It was definitely about a cover-up. I remember that. Yeah.
It's about chemical pollution from a plant. Yeah.
That's right.
Hence, the pelican population is being sickened in some way, but I forget exactly. It's like Monsanto, not Monsanto. It's like Union Carbide. I mean, it's a relation, like the Bhopal, thing. But that was a sudden incident. This was a progressive leak of waste products or something. Yeah.
Yes, that's well remembered. That rings a bell. Yeah.
Would it help if I told you it was Denzel Washington playing the lead character? Would it help you remember more?
Yes. Okay. I need to go back and look at it again, don't I?
Yeah, but
So I can dig it up.
he's played so many people. I mean, like
Yeah,
the book Eli and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Great. Well, Tony and Jeremy, thank you both very much for all your insights and the reading from your novel, Tony, and Jeremy, all the reading that you've done that you've given us information about. So I hope we can find a way of providing the references on the chat for the recording as well as what we're saying, because there really is a wealth of reading for all of us there and lots of books to follow up on. So thank you both very much for an absorbing and different joining enough talk, and thanks to all of those of you who've been here and taken part. So thank you again.